The first thing I want to show you is how our world mapping, as compared to our standard mapping, our object mapping, differs once we're using just a procedural terrain. So let's start out by adding a procedural terrain to our scene. And I'm going to zoom out so we can see this a little bit better. And I'm going to double click on our terrain to open up our terrain editor. And we can see our procedural terrain in here. What I want to do is increase our pixel resolution of our preview. So we can just click ×2, and we can see that a little bit better. And this should be good for right now. Now, one thing to note about procedural terrains is that we have a new option, which works a little bit differently than the standard terrain. We have 0 edges. Now, when you're using a standard terrain and you click on 0 edges, it will typically just lower our overall edges, making it into more of an island mountain shape, where we have the outside edges going down to pretty much black and zeroed out. But in the procedural terrain function, what it actually works as, it's either an on or off. Rather than adding to it constantly by clicking, we either turn it on or off. So currently, by default, it is on, and I'm just going to click on it right now and turn it off. And now we can see what happens is, we can see our overall function of our terrain, and without any of the edges being pulled downwards in order to make it into a mountain type shape. And we can also see why the terrain was created so low to begin with, and that's because with the function that we have on, if we take a look, the center right now is quite small. So once 0 edges is on, it removes all of our higher parts, and all we see is that center, which is a lot lower. So we'll just turn that back off. And what we want to do is change our mapping mode, and I'm just going to stick with our standard default right now. And if we take a look at the function editor, we can just see that this is a simple fractal, Perlin noise's value, and our wavelength is set to 0.1757 on all axes, and our origin is also a bit askew and not quite at 0, 0, 0. So let's just click OK, and we're going to change our mapping mode to world parametric. And now it is going to ask us if we'd like to preserve the current geometry. I'm just going to click no, because we haven't made any changes in the overall size of our terrain, so it's not really going to affect us. And I'm going to keep our default scale of 1 right now, and just click OK. So now we can see our terrain in our scene. And what I just want to do is raise this up a little bit on the Z-axis. So we want to make sure that we're in the move mode so we can see that gizmo. And if we need to increase or decrease the size of these gizmos, we can easily do that on the number pad with the plus and minus keys. If I hit minus, it will make the gizmo smaller. If I hit the plus key, it will make our gizmo larger. So if you're working with really large terrains, sometimes it's easier just to make your gizmos a lot larger, and that way you can easily access these different controllers. So I'm just going to pull this up a little bit higher, and that way we're not going into our infinite plane on the ground plane. And what I want to do is zoom out so we can see this a little bit better, because we're going to be scaling this, and just make a note of exactly what this terrain looks like, and that we have just an overall, basically a small amount of detail as far as our larger peaks, where we just have this one on the right and just a little bit on the left side of our terrain. So let's go ahead and scale this up. And we'll let that refresh. And now we can see the overall terrain pretty much looks exactly the same. And the reason for that is we're in the parametric mode. So what I'm going to do is just undo that scale that we had created and go back to that default size that we had go back into our terrain editor, and we want to change our mapping mode from world parametric to just world. It's going to ask us once again if we'd like to add nodes. I'm just going to click no because I'm not worried about preserving our geometry. But now we can see the sort of change that we have in relation to that overall mapping mode. So we'll click OK, and we can already see that we have a much smaller amount of our function being created, or at least more of our function being created in smaller areas. Now, one thing I want to do so we can see this a little bit better is I'm going to increase our scale, which is now a global scale and the world scale. And we bring that up to 4. And now we're about where we were before with our parametric mode. I'm going to click OK. And now we can see our terrain. We can also see we basically have the same shape before, where we have that higher peak on the right and then just a little on the left. Let's take a look now at the sizing and what happens when we scale our terrain now that we're in our world map mode. I'm going to change this to our scale gizmo, and we're just going to increase the size of this, and once we let go, our terrain is going to recalculate, and now we see an entirely different size and just something entirely different than what we had before. But if we take a look in the center area, we still have the exact same terrain that we had before in this smaller section, and all we've really done is expanded on what we already created. So as I increase the size, we're not increasing the size of our procedural function at all, but just the size of our terrain within that function. Now, of course, we are raising it as well on our z-axis, so we are also raising it up. But if I was to decrease our z-axis, now we can see our original terrain in the center here, where we had that raised part on the right and that more level area on the left, but also all of this extra geometry that we've added because we're now in a world mode. So therefore, the size of our function is just defining the overall unit and is not connected to the actual size of the terrain anymore. If we kept it in parametric mode or object mode, then as we scaled it, the overall shape is going to stay exactly the same. So I can increase this even larger if I wanted to, and we'll let that recalculate, and we can still see that same geometry in the same place right here, but now we're seeing more of our function. And that's just something you want to keep in mind really before you start creating your terrains, really which mode you want to be working in. Basically because if I was to position our scene, and let's just move in our camera so we can see this area, and I'm just going to set up an example. And if we just take a look, and let's say we like the way our terrain looks at this level, but we really need some more definition in the back, and we need some more mountainous areas. Well, typically if we were to use the object mode and we made it larger, then what would happen is we would lose where our position was with the camera and our overall shape of our terrain. But since we're in world mode, we can keep the exact same overall dimensions and shape of our terrain, but just increase the amount of procedural function that we are seeing and just add extra geometry rather than removing the geometry or sizing the geometry we already have. Now keep in mind too, you will have to decrease your z-axis as you do that. Of course, one thing you can always do is keep your z exactly the same and instead just adjust your x and your y. So we're going to do that right now. Rather than sizing all of our axes, we want to keep this height exactly the same, so we're going to use our x and our y and just make that larger. Pull that out. Once we let go, it will recalculate our terrain. And if we take a look at our preview, we can see our mountains are still in the exact same place, but now we have all of this extra geometry and these extra mountains in the back, extending more towards our horizon. And another thing to keep in mind is our material. Now if I had a set material on this, and let's just go ahead and take a look at our material currently for this terrain. So I'm going to double click. We can see that the mapping mode is still set to object parametric. And that's because they're basically different. We have our mapping mode for our overall terrain and its shape, and then the mapping mode for our material. So if I was to keep that on our object parametric mode for our material, every time we sized our terrain, our material would change. But if we change our material to a world mapping mode, we can just go up here and just select World Standard and click OK. Now no matter how much I size our terrain, our material is going to stay in the exact same place with the same dimensions. And that way we can still expand upon the amount of geometry we have just by increasing the x and the y if we want to keep our height the same. And I think in that case I actually made it a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to pull that out. And we'll make it really large. And we'll let that recalculate. And now we can see we still have those mountains that we were positioned on before, plus all of these ones in the background. And if we had a material on that that was specifically sized to the area that we wanted, we wouldn't have to worry about losing that geometry or losing the position of that material in relation to our geometry size. So that's just definitely one thing you want to keep in mind before you start working on your terrains, whether or not you're going to need to change them or adjust them at all. And if we take a look at the actual terrain in our editor now, we'll go ahead and double click to open up our terrain editor. And if you ever run into a problem where you double click and it does not open the terrain editor, there is an alternate way of getting into there. And what we can do is right mouse click on our object and select Edit Object. And that will open up the terrain editor if it did not open when you double clicked. Now we can see this terrain overall. It's extremely spiky now. It's very difficult to tell where the details are, basically because we are stretching upwards. And the preview of our terrain in the editor is different from the scale that we have set for our z-axis within the actual scene. But we can also see that our scale for our function is still set to 4 as it was before. And our entire amount of what we're seeing is entirely based on the size because of that world mapping mode. So those are just definitely a couple of things you want to pay attention to. And now let's take a look at actually working on some procedural terrains within the function editor. So I'm going to start out just by creating a new scene. Going to File, New. I'm going to stick with our default atmosphere because that renders fairly quickly. I'm not going to save that. And now let's load in a procedural terrain. I'm going to zoom out so we can see it a little bit better. And just position it in our viewport. And let's double click to open up our terrain editor. Turn off zero edges, so we are just looking at the actual function without any additions or any modifications to the actual terrain. And I'm going to keep this in object parametric mode because I'm not going to be changing the scale of our terrain at all. And we're basically going to be looking at the overall functions, and really that doesn't affect which mode we're in, unless of course we were working with different scales. Now, if you don't want to be working with really small numbers within our function editor, because of course with the object parametric mode on, we are going to be working with smaller numbers, basically a lot of numbers underneath the scale of 1. So if you want to work with something a little bit larger, you can switch that to your world mapping mode, and that way you can be using values between 10 and 100 rather than values between with very small decimal numbers up to about 1, or maybe a little bit higher. I'm going to click ×2 just to increase the overall resolution of our terrain so we can see it a little bit better. And if you're not entirely familiar with the terrain editor, there are a couple of things I just want to show you really quick. If we take a look at the altitude on the bottom, we can see we have a gradient. And this is the gradient that we're seeing to actually generate and map to our terrain. And this goes for both standard terrains and procedural, no matter how we're working within the terrain editor. And what we can do is actually edit this map. You can just right mouse click and go to edit, and now we can see all of the points and all of the colors making up this overall terrain. What we can also do is right mouse click and load a color map, and this will bring up our chooser for all of the different gradients available. You can actually use any gradient that you want. You could even use a solid color. So you're not exactly confined by the gradients that are within a specific section. You can use any one that you want. There are specific terrain editor maps that work really well for terrains, and you can choose any one of these to change the overall look of your terrain. But like I said, you can easily use any of the other ones available to adjust what your terrain is going to look like. And this is helpful if you know kind of the material that you want to put on your terrain already, because then you can see sort of a preview render without actually applying the material to the actual object. And so while you're working with it, you can see a little bit better. If we change this to, let's take a look at our rocks and grass. We have our green-purple. I'm going to click OK, and we'll take a look at that. And we can see our higher peaks are that darker brown color, and the rest of it is more of a tan color. Right mouse click, load color map. We could select something else. Red desolate. Click OK. And now we can see the effect of that gradient map on our overall terrain. And we could try any one of these. Like I said, we could also use this. Let's just use our dark stone. And then we could also do is actually take a look at the overall effect of black and white as if we were looking at this from the original map. And one of the nice things about using the black and white mode is it actually tells us and shows us our highest points as white in relation to the actual values that are being created by our nodes in our function editor. And also if you're working with the standard terrain, if you're working with specific image maps and applying those, this will pretty much show you the exact same map that was created to create the actual terrain. But I'm going to change this back. Just load a color map, go to our terrain editor maps, and I'm going to select our green canyon, which is our default, because this gives us a very good overall value of different elevations. We can see flatter areas a little bit better, which is one of the helpful things about using a multicolor gradient, is that we can see our flatter areas. Of course, in this area right here, we can see we have some brown sections that carry on across, and we can tell that those are all the same elevation because they are all within the same color. And since we have so many colors within our map, it makes it easier to tell and easier to work with our terrain. If we take a look just underneath our altitudes, we can see we have a clip, and this allows us to alter our terrain and actually clip it downward and its overall elevation both up and down. So we can clip both from the bottom and the top if you're looking for a specific type of effect, or if you just want to cut out certain areas of your terrain. And that works for both your standard and your procedural terrains. So now let's go into the function editor and actually start working on some terrains and going through a lot of the different nodes and different options we can use to create our terrains. Just going to expand this a little. And we're going to go up to the top and we want to click on our function output observer. And what I want to do is select our fit vertically because we are working with just a procedural terrain, and the full extent of this terrain will be stretched out, and this is basically what we see in the actual terrain editor outside of the function editor for our terrain that is currently set. We can also preview this. We can scale that down if we want to see a little bit more without actually adjusting the size of our overall terrain. And that's helpful in the world mapping mode if you plan on scaling out, or if you're in the standard mode or the object mode, you can just adjust your overall function size, which is currently set to 1. We also have an only when saturating option. So if I check that, we're actually going to end up with a terrain that looks extremely similar to just when we have fit vertically off. And typically when you're working with a procedural terrain, you just want to keep that only when saturating off, and that way we can see the full extent of our terrain throughout its overall scale. And we also have another option within the function editor that can be helpful. If we go ahead and click next to our function output observer, we can see we have function node preview. And this is going to give us an overall profile of what our terrain is going to look like with each of our different axes. What we can do is actually move within just by clicking with the left mouse button and moving, and that way we can adjust our curves. And now this doesn't actually affect anything in our actual terrain. It just gives us a preview of what things look like. We can also adjust that manually to move within our curve and see what it looks like. And if we hold down Control and right mouse click, we can expand and pretty much zoom in and zoom out of this curve and see a little bit more of what the function looks like. And I'm just going to close this out because I mostly prefer just working with our output observer because it really gives us enough of a preview to actually see our terrain, and I really don't need to see the curves all that much. So let's take a look at some of the settings within our function editor. If you take a look, we can see that right now this is being created by our simple fractal. If you take a look at the top, we can see we have our input nodes, where we have a couple of different ones: position, normal, altitude, slope, orientation, and time. And then on the bottom we have our output node. Now basically with terrains we're going to be working on everything traveling to our output node, which is our altitude, because that's what we're working on creating, is our altitude. So we start out with our position, which is our input. This travels to our fractal node, and then this is then outputted and put into our output node, which is our altitude. We have a couple of different options for viewing our overall nodes. If we take a look up the top, next to our previews, we have a zoom in and out function, so we can zoom into our scene. If I right mouse click, we can pan around and move our view, and click to zoom in. And then if we need to fit a specific area, just next to our zoom in and out, we have a frame selected area. If we click on that, got to reposition here, to the left of our frame selected area, we have a frame mode, which will automatically frame everything in our function. But I'm just going to zoom out, reselect that frame selected area, and then we can click and drag out a selection, and once we let go, it'll zoom in just to that area. I'm just going to frame it so we have this entirely in view. To the left of that, we have our undo and redo options. And typically you want to click directly on these buttons rather than using a shortcut of Control-Z, because it tends to work a little bit better if we actually click on the buttons, and it's not necessarily assigned to your keyboard shortcut of Control-Z for undo. So you'll want to use, for the undo and redo options, you'll actually want to click on the buttons rather than use keyboard shortcuts unless you have already set something up. To the left of that, we have the ability to cut, copy, and paste, so we can select specific nodes, copy them, paste them, create duplicates, and we can also just cut them out as well. And to the left of that, we have a Show Parameter Connections. If I select that, what we're going to see, I'm just going to frame selected area, and we're going to zoom into this node. We can see all of these different connections on the right that are now showing up. And these connections represent what we have the ability to control within our node. We have wavelength, origin, largest feature, smallest feature, roughness, gain, and then if we're using a filter, we have a creep in, min, and max. And these can all be controlled with different nodes. And this just gives us the ability to quickly connect them if we know exactly which ones we want to work with. And if we just leave our mouse over that, we can see it show up with a little pop-up that tells us exactly what that node and connection is. So we move down to the bottom, we can see this is the one for our gain. We have one for our smallest feature, origin. And sometimes it's just helpful to have those up already rather than clicking extract parameter and then having to convert the node that it creates. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So we'll click frame so we can see our full node. I'm just going to keep our show parameter connections up. And now let's take a look to the left where we have our graph options. Go ahead and click, and we have a couple of different options here. We can show all previews in our graph. In other words, we're going to see exactly what our node looks like rather than just text. And sometimes all that will show up is text, whether or not we have show in graph on. If we take a look at the specific node, we can see that show in graph is selected. If I turn off this checkbox, now we no longer see the preview of our actual node. We just see the text, which says simple fractal. This can be a good way for organizing your entire scene. So if you have a bunch of different nodes that you're working with, and you're not really working with some of the other ones anymore, you can just turn off show and graph to collapse them, and then you don't have to worry about them getting in the way anymore. Show all previews in graph will take anything that is turned off and automatically turn them on, so that show and graph will be on. So if we select show all previews, then they're all going to show up. We can also preview only noises and colors, and we can also hide all of our previews so everything collapses. So that can be very helpful considering that you can create some extremely large functions by the time you're done editing a lot of different things, and that can be very helpful for viewing. So it's not so confusing when you take a look at your function and you just see tons of nodes everywhere. We also have a preview options that's located up here. We can select that. In this we can change our preview for our nodes, whether or not we'd like to view them as cubes, and we can see that update automatically, as a marble, so a smaller sphere, cylinder, a cone, an XY plane, so that we're just viewing the actual material and just the node and not on any 3D space, and a 2D plane. 2D plane is going to be the best representation for the actual node. Sphere is the default, but I'm going to change this to 2D plane and work with that because it's going to be a lot easier to actually see what we're working with, because we're not really worried about any of the lighting effects, which is basically what these 3D shapes are for. If we're working with a cylindrical surface when actually editing materials rather than terrains, then some of these other options will be more helpful. But I'm going to select our 2D plane because this is really the best for working with terrains. We can also adjust our background type, but since we don't have really a background anymore, since we changed it, we don't have to worry about that. If I set that back to a sphere, we can change from uniform and checker, and we can also use our local light or turn that off. We can also adjust the background color. So right now if I change this to uniform, or even with checker, we can still see we have that blue and white. We can adjust this gradient to change the background. But I'm going to change that to our 2D plane. We don't need to worry about any of these options. I'm going to turn off our local light since it's not really going to affect it, and just close that out. So let's take a look at the left now, which is all of our different nodes that we have available for editing our terrains. Take a look at the top. We can see we have input nodes. We have our output nodes. Underneath that is our noise. Now currently it's saying replace by noise, and that's because we have one of our nodes selected. And this currently is a fractal node, which we can see highlighted. And if I was to select our noise, it's going to replace this fractal with a noise node. If I was to click off, now we can create entirely custom nodes, and we can see that we can add a noise node, or we can add a fractal node. Underneath that, we have a color node, which we're not going to need to worry about when editing terrains. It's basically for materials, and since we use the exact same function editor for both editing materials and terrains, you'll find that a lot of the options really aren't available, or they really won't create the sort of effects that you'd like, or they might do nothing at all to the actual object, because we are only editing altitude, and we're not really editing anything else. And basically some of these are mainly for materials, and editing terrains, they're not really going to give you any extra bit of altitude. Underneath that, we have a texture map node, which we can use to add on to our different nodes to control different amounts of altitude. And what we'd want to do then is use our grayscale images, so we'd want them to be black and white. And we can actually control our height and elevation with some of those nodes. Located underneath that is our filter node, which we'll be going through because there's a lot of different options we can use with our filters. Underneath that is a constant node. Constant nodes are typically something that's created when we extract our parameters. If I was to select onto our simple fractal and I want to extract our origin, it's going to create a constant node. If we take a look at our constant node options, we have constant vector, constant texture coordinates, constant number, and constant color. Now because we are working with multiple values where we have the x, y, and z, currently the only thing that is available is our constant vector. Now in this case, creating and extracting this isn't really going to do us any good as a constant node, just because it's exactly the same as it was before. Instead of the values being located within our node, they're now in another node, which might be helpful if you're going to be editing this constantly in multiple times, where you want to have that just extracted, and that way you don't have to click on the node and edit directly within the origin. You can just go ahead and click on that node and edit that value. Or you can also connect other things directly to it, which is one of the things that makes it helpful. But what I'm going to do is just delete that. And we're not really going to be using a lot of constant nodes, just because with this case, and for a lot of these terrains, they really aren't going to give us any extra power for editing anything, unless of course we want to connect something directly to the origin. So if I wanted this origin to be connected to another node, we could connect to that constant node. And if we were to extract one of our values that is just one set number, and let's do roughness, and we just extract that, now we can see our constant node is set to a constant number. And then we can adjust our overall value or type in that amount. And I'm just going to remove that. If we take a look underneath our constant nodes, we have our turbulence node, which is a very powerful node and has some really neat abilities, and we'll be taking a look at that quite a bit and using it quite frequently to create some really neat effects within our different terrains. And we'll be seeing that once we start getting into actually editing our nodes. Underneath that is our combiner node. This is used for a number of different things. Basically what we can do is combine multiple nodes all within the same output, and we'll also be using that one quite a bit as well. Underneath that is our last node, which is our math node. A lot of these math node functions will not be available and not very helpful for editing our terrains, but a lot of them will be, and we'll see those as well once we start combining everything.